Time and time again, I keep my clients from making the same mistakes over and over again. And I've personally made all three of these mistakes that I'm going to discuss in today's video. And making any one of these mistakes can definitely lead you to just growing way less muscle or having that muscle growth take way longer than it needs to be. So the first one I'm going to talk about here today is focusing too much on the weight that you're lifting. And if you're noticing it right now, yes, I did get a new tattoo. I'll show you some B-roll of that at the end of this video if you happen to give a shit. But first off, focusing too much on the weight you're lifting. So people think that they need to lift more and more weight every single session so they can grow muscle. And this is just absolutely 100% not the case. And they usually think this because they think, oh, progressive overload means you need to do more each session. And that is not the case. Check out my video on progressive overload if you want to see more information about that. But essentially, progressive overload dictates that you need to do more total workload in the gym to continue to facilitate adaptations as adaptations occur. So the rate in which you increase your workload should be relative to how fast your adaptations are occurring, as in one single week, you're really not going to grow very much muscle tissue. I don't care how good your genetics are. So given that's the case, the amount of workload you need to do this week compared to last week probably isn't that different. And if you especially consider that as you're going through a training cycle, you're probably accumulating fatigue. So even if you did the same workload, you're doing it under more fatigue, and that can be a way to be a bit more overloading, even if you're doing the same amount of work. So you definitely don't need to do more and more every session. I think often people kind of think they need to, and then they start focusing too much on the weight they're lifting. And I know for me personally, this kind of got me into doing like sumo deadlifts. And sumo deadlifts, they can be a good lift, but the way that I'm structured, when I do sumo deadlifts, I am moving the bar like 3 or 4 inches. And I could pull a lot of weight. I think I got up to like doing 475 for a set of 5 or 6. And that's not like crazy, but I think I was at like 160 pounds when doing that. So with that said, I was lifting a lot of weight, but only moving the bar like 4 inches. And I really wasn't stimulating hypertrophy that much with doing these, but I was causing a lot of fatigue because I had so much weight on the bar, and it was causing a lot of kind of axial loading of holding that bar in my hands in front of me. So this led to just generating a lot of fatigue and not very much stimulus. And I think that a lot of people, when they focus too much on just the weight that they're lifting, they end up generating a lot of fatigue and maybe a little bit less stimulus because they start throwing their form out of the window, or they start to just arbitrarily shorten the range of motion. And, I'm not saying that you shouldn't focus on lifting more weight over time, but it shouldn't be at the expense of reducing range of motion and throwing technique out the window and just overall generating less stimulus just so you can move more weight. I don't think that's a good trade-off at all when you're focused on building muscle. And I also think that, when I was starting out, I kind of had a power building style of a program in which really I only cared about growing muscle and really how I looked. And I think trying to kind of do powerlifting plus bodybuilding, yeah, it can work to some extent. And there are some people in which that approach might work better for. But I think that if you really are honest with yourself and you just care about looking better and lifting for mostly aesthetic purposes, then I think that trying to do both powerlifting and bodybuilding at the same time, it's just going to lead to less results or even just spinning your wheels. All right, so mistake number 1 is focusing too much on the weight you're lifting. Now, number 2 is focusing too much on short-term leanness and being too lean right now. I know that throughout my career, I spent way too much time in a fat loss phase, and there was definitely years of my training in which I might have only spent a couple months out of the year eating at maintenance or eating in a slight surplus. And that is a very good way to just not grow any muscle, as if you don't gain any weight, where do you expect that muscle to come from? And also, when you're kind of just starting out, for me anyways, even when I was lean, I didn't look the way I wanted to look because I just didn't have enough muscle to have the look that I wanted. And I think that this is a kind of big mistake people can make when they're starting out is, for one, they just don't have much muscle, but they also don't like how they look when they're lean. And they think the answer is to get leaner. And when in reality, the answer is just kind of suck it up their first few years of gaining, build some muscle, and then when they cut back down, they'll have something to cut down too. Because if you're just generally under muscled, you're not going to have much to cut down to, and you probably won't like how you look when you are lean. So generally, I would recommend making sure to spend at least like 70+% of your year eating enough food. So at least at maintenance or slight surplus. Now, is this going to be different if someone is not in a healthy body fat range right now? Absolutely. I would say if you're a male and you're above about 20% body fat and female, maybe above about 30%, I would say it might be better for you to start in a fat loss phase, get down into a healthy body fat range, and then you can start using that rule of eating enough food for about 70-75% of the year, assuming you stay within that healthy body fat range. And the third mistake that I see that is made all too often is just changing things up way too much. And this could be your training and this could be your nutrition as well. As a lot of people, they will, want to change from gaining to cutting and cutting to gaining, and they'll just keep doing, throwing mini cuts in because they really don't like how they're looking in the gaining phase, and they just never spend enough time in a single phase to actually make progress towards their goal. And I think that a really good rule of thumb is before you enter a gaining phase, I think you should ask yourself a question like, will I be able to sustain this gaining phase, or will I be comfortable enough in this gaining phase to commit to it for at least about 6 months at a time? As for my clients, I do not like running mini cuts in the middle of a gaining phase and stuff like that. Is often it just throws off momentum and it leads to less growth over time. And I would say for the best results for myself and my clients, it's when we stick to gaining for several months at a time, if not a year plus at a time, and really gaining that momentum and building appreciable muscle tissue. And this whole changing things up can also be applied to your training, in which people will change up their split a lot, or they'll start, they'll hear something in a podcast like training at stretched muscle lengths and long ranges of motion, and then they'll start changing all their training over to that. And they just don't really stick to anything long enough to actually see appreciable progress in it. And yeah, you can make progress when you're still switching things up quite a bit, but at some point it can be hard to actually drive adaptations when you're changing things up so much. And that's not to say you shouldn't ever change things up. Like for a lot of my clients, I will kind of sprinkle things in to just try them out, in which we'll sprinkle in, okay, we'll try a weighted stretch on a couple exercises this meso, or we'll do some drop sets or some same muscle supersets or some giant sets, and we'll just kind of sprinkle those things in. But the core fundamentals of our program still don't change. And we still stick to those evidence-based fundamentals of having an appropriate level of volume, having an appropriate frequency, rep range, reps in reserve, stuff like that. So try to avoid focusing too much on the weight you're lifting to the extent that you're just generating more fatigue compared to the stimulus you're getting. Also, try to avoid kind of the trap of focusing on being too lean right now and never really committing to a gaining phase. And also avoid the mistake of changing things up way too much when it comes to both your training and nutrition. And really, this stuff, it takes time. And I think it makes a lot of sense to stick to something for a while to gain momentum in it. And then you can make small, minor adjustments and kind of sprinkle things in here and there. Now, as I play some B-roll of my new tattoo here, another mistake people make is choosing the wrong exercises. So if that is you, make sure you check this video out here.